You're listening to The Naked Pravda. This is a new show from Meduza, our first English language podcast. So please don't be shy about recommending us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're tuning in. Welcome to The Naked Pravda, a new podcast that highlights how Meduza's top reporting intersects with the wider research and expertise that exists about Russia. Meduza publishes a lot of in-depth original journalism, but these stories' links to the wider community of experts and reporters working in this field aren't always clear. I'm your host, Kevin Rotrok, the managing editor of Meduza's English language edition, and on today's show, we'll be talking about leaked databases and how the black market for this information has become a key aspect of Russian law enforcement and investigative journalism in Russia. The Russian Presidential Affairs Department's Scientific Research Computing Center. That's something we're going to talk about a lot in this story, but we're going to call it GRCC to maintain our sanity. This whole thing, the GRCC, develops systems to monitor and de-anonymize social media users, and it sells these systems to government and private clients alike. Using the services Pskov and Sherlock, for example, insurance companies can root out dishonest employees and security guard companies can recruit new staff. Poseidon, meanwhile, which is another one of these programs, allows the police to hunt down extremists online. Meduza has learned that these computing systems collect information on Russians not just from open sources, but from leaked databases that are sold illegally on the black market in Russia. Many of those using these systems, moreover, are the same law enforcement officials who leaked the private data in the first place.
There was a guy I've met through covering the story about Russian mercenaries fighting in Africa, Libya, and Syria.
This, by the way, is Lilия Яппарова. She's the Meduza investigative correspondent.
And he once told me,
who wrote The Information Nation, a Kremlin-managed research center, is selling services that can de-anonymize anyone in Russia.
And I was completely surprised to hear it, that once when he was working for an insurance company, one of the biggest in Russia, he accidentally found himself at the presentation. There were some usual salespeople, but the product they were presenting, it was kind of awkward, strange, and a bit too expensive to buy. But the product itself, it was interesting and provocative.
In the summer of 2017, one of her sources witnessed the presentation of two products from GRCC that sales agents said would allow subscribers to retrieve the full resume of any individual, including passport numbers, criminal records, and more, all with minimal initial data. Access to the systems cost 18 million rubles, more than $275,000 per month.
When he was using the software, it was called Sherlock, he said that I always wanted to check if I could punch someone in the face through the internet, for the web. And when I was using Sherlock, this Sherlock software, I felt like I'm finally doing this. I'm finally capable of it. It's pretty handy, but there is a catch. This Sherlock system pulls from some databases, which usually only Russian Interior Ministry has access to. So it's pretty illegal too.
The services designed by GRCC wouldn't function without Russia's highly developed black market for buying and selling leaked and stolen personal data through gray DBMS, database management systems. Aptitude with gray database management systems like Kronos or Sprut is a nearly required skill for anyone applying to work as security personnel at a major corporation in Russia, where many security staff are former intelligence agents. According to Meduza's sources in law enforcement, where officials are responsible for leaking the personal data in the first place, the Interior Ministry and other police agencies fall back on GRCC's services because it cuts through the red tape of formal investigative procedures. But Lilya says money is what really drives this whole underground world.
It started in the 90s, so I do believe that at first they just wanted to earn some money. I think it's still the same. There is a huge black market for personal data of Russian citizens. And it continues to exist and expand even, because sometimes there's just no way you can get the same information legally. And people who leak these databases on the market, they can profit profit very well from that. So I think it's money.
Like anywhere you find money and power, GRCC's search technology is prone to abuse. Lilia says she remembers one episode in particular where this invasive software was turned against an unsuspecting nanny.
Okay, my favorite story is when they used the full force of Sherlock to dig up some stuff on a nanny. One of the main Russian state-owned corporations asked GRCC to do a background check on a completely unknown woman. The analyst at GRCC thought she might be something serious, a criminal or a businesswoman, but they found nothing. It was only later explained to them that they were just checking a babysitter for one of the corporate executives.
Now, you might be listening to this, and you're about ready to dismiss GRCC as another Kremlin project to violate civil liberties and profit off of innocent people. But first consider that the architects of systems like Sherlock only turn to illegal databases out of desperation to do something good. Now, that's not necessarily an excuse, but it's something.
I don't want to advocate for the developers of Sherlock, but sometimes GRCC bought leaked databases directly from the black market. But I do believe it wasn't their aim to be the bad guy. They just wanted to make a good product, and it was the only way to do so. I mean, Russian special services and Russian Interior Ministry, they don't like to share information, and they didn't make an exception for GRCC. And one of the developers of Sherlock explained it like this. He told me, sometimes this phone number from the leaked pizza delivery service database is the only link to some criminal, and that was what I was telling myself when we used some illegal data. I don't think that these products were created for spying on civilians. I think it was for the developers behind it. I don't mean the GRU or FSB guys or the military. I mean the developers, the young guys behind the products. They were aiming for some state-level important work.
In other words, the developers behind these search systems accepted trade-offs when deciding to connect their work to these illegal databases. Lilia says they knew they were engaging in unethical behavior, but it was necessary, they figured, for the greater good of catching criminals. State officials accept compromises like this all the time when weighing civil liberties against safety and security threats. Most of us aren't policymakers, so this kind of moral calculus is probably a bit alien. But when I was reading Lilia's report and thinking about this podcast episode, it dawned on me that I make similar concessions all the time whenever I sign away a bit more of my privacy to some corporation in exchange for new services and features. In nearly every corner of my house, there's a live microphone listening for wake words programmed by Amazon, Google, or Apple. I asked my wife if she wanted to talk about this on mic for this show, thinking it would be interesting to share with listeners how we approach this issue as a family. But she didn't want to. And when I asked, I only reminded her that she doesn't really like having these devices in our home in the first place. In the US, I don't know if there's much reason to worry about police agencies accessing whatever private data is floating around about me in leaked databases, but businesses are without a doubt selling that information. So there's that. To find out more about Russia's database black market and how this information is being used to unmask Russian spies, I spoke to two top researchers at Bellingcat, the investigative journalism website that's unearthed damning evidence tying the Kremlin to the downing of a passenger jet over eastern Ukraine in 2014 and the Novichok nerve agent attack in Salisbury, England last year. Bellingcat and its partners inside Russia, like investigative journalist Roman Dobrohodov at The Insider, are changing the way journalists use both open source and gray source information to report on clandestine government activities.
It's an evolving animal. It started as a collection of nerds with a passion for open source validation and verification that happened to reach out to one another on the internet and on Twitter.
You said a collection of nerds? Is that what you said?
Yes. Some of the earlier, the core of Bellingcat, we're all nerds, yeah?
That's Hристо Grozев, one of Bellingcat's senior researchers who focuses on Russia-related security and information threats.
And of all ages and of all backgrounds. So it was not it was not a collection of people based on some education or on some particular skill set, but one passion was nerdiness and ability to spend hours and hours on something that may yield no results. And usually this comes at the expense of spending time with things that matter, such as family and so on and so forth. So anybody who qualifies for not caring about that and how they'll be perceived by family was welcome to join Bellingcat. I personally did not join in the early months. I was aware of this community and I was independently blogging with a focus on open source or at least on data investigations at the same time. We focused on one of the same topics, which was MH17, me and my blogs and Elliot and some of the early team around him on the Bellingcat website, which was just set up at about the same time.
He's referring here, by the way, to Elliot Higgins, the British citizen journalist and former blogger who founded Bellingcat using open source information like videos, maps, and pictures.
And at one point, Elliot reached out to me and said, well, do you mind writing something for Bellingcat on a topic that you seem to be sort of proficient on? And I think I wrote the first thing in early 2015. Then the first major investigation I did for Bellingcat was the Montenegro failed coup attempt and the possible role of Jiri into it. And that kind of opened a whole new vector of investigations, which focused on Russian extraterritorial operations, Secret Service operations, which became, I mean, it's almost like a movie by now with many, or let's say a Netflix series with many seasons by now.
Christo came to Bellingcat after many years of broadcast radio, but the investigative team has all kinds of folks.
Was doing a adjacent, not really Russia-focused job, and just for fun, I was...
Here's Arik Толер, Bellingcat's Eastern Europe and Eurasia lead researcher and trainer.
So I've been doing this for 5 years now. I did it as a volunteer at first, but now I make a living off of it, and I do some investigation stuff into Russia, but also I do trainings and workshops and things like that, teaching other people how to do like digital stalking, more or less. So what we do at Bellingcat is we are more or less people who spend way too much time online and find stuff online, verify things online, and kind of bring together stories off of the digital breadcrumbs that we come across. So, for example, just yesterday, the day before, we published a news story. So like the 14th, we published a story about the wedding of this GRU commander's daughter. And so there's this like big bad GRU commander that the New York Times wrote about last week. And he runs this unit that's been doing all sorts of nasty stuff across Europe and the Caucasus and so on. And so we've spent literally 40 hours searching everything we could about this guy. His name is Under Averyanov. And trying to figure out his entire family tree and everything, because buried in this New York Times story was a mention about how one of the Skripal poisoners, this guy named Anatoly Chapiga, how he was at this GRU commander's daughter's wedding back in 2017, which is a year before the poisoning. So what we did is we more or less stalked every imaginable contact and family member and friend of everything at this Averyanov family. And after probably dozens and dozens of hours of research, we finally found his daughter's real name, found his son-in-law, her husband, and we found the wedding. And they use a hashtag for the wedding. It was hashtag Bakaryov wedding, I think, because there's some guy named Bakaryov that
they use the hashtag themselves.
Yeah, and the guests did too, because this is this really posh, fancy wedding. Because these guys are rich. He has his own driver. He's a rich military commander guy, and so he put on this super fancy wedding in this posh Moscow, very, very Instagram friendly wedding.
It's kind of basic, don't you think? It's
this is really New York City basic 7 years ago, and now it's cutting edge fashion. But so this had this very Instagram friendly wedding that his daughter put on, and so we looked through all the guests and the family and everything, and we eventually found the wedding photographer and they hired a videographer too to do a 2.5 minute super spiffy video about the wedding. And all this footage and all these photos and all these videos and everything we found from the guests and the wedding, the bride and groom themselves and the videographer and the wedding photographer, we found 4 or 5 photos and videos that show Chapiga, who is the Skripal poisoner, the one who was interviewed on RT by Margot Simonyan. We found him among the guests for the daughter of a GRU commander's wedding. So this is kind of what we do, is we just go through and we just exhaust every possible angle you can think of. Staring at family trees on Kontakte, on the Klasniki and Facebook and so on. And we just go through everything we possibly can and then, pull stories together from it.
The GRU wedding story has many of the same features as previous investigative reports about Russian spies. But how do these stories come together? Christo and Arik explained Bellingcat's workflow, which relies almost entirely on volunteer initiative and the miracle of Slack.
Very often, it would be just an idea, a topic that somebody of the team of 30-something people that are actively scouting out new ideas would feel passionate about, would open a new channel on our Slack platform and would say, oh, who wants to join? And then you would have between 1 and or between 0 and 15 additional members that will say, hey, I'm interested in that.
It really depends on what we're looking at, but usually we have kind of a standard, like things you do in your sleep. Like, you find a person, well, what you do is first thing you try to do is find out their birthday and their patronymic if you can. So this Averyanov guy, well, for example, we're trying to find his daughter because his daughter would have stuff about her wedding. So we know that her dad's name is Andrei. So she's on something, Andreevna Averyanova. Mm-hmm. So what we did is we have all sorts of leaked databases, which we'll talk about in a bit, like Moscow residential databases, Moscow car registration databases, flight databases, things like that. And we can do a wildcard search, which wildcard search is like a little asterisk, shift 8, and it just means anything, right? So you have the first name is like the wildcard. It can be anything. It could be Larissa, Anastasia, whatever. And then the patronymic is Andreevna, and the last name is Averyanova. And then we can guess that she was probably born in the late 80s, early 90s, based on her, being married recently. So then we just kind of have like this big, giant pool of candidates of different women who are about the right age and have the right patronymic and right last name. So then we just pull through and look for every single one of these people and see if, and also, we find the family of Andrei, the GRU commander, and we find if there's any overlapping connections between the daughter or potential daughters and the confirmed GRU commander, because, his brother would be her uncle, and they're probably friends on, Facebook or on the Classic or something like that. And once we find an overlap, with lots of different common connections, then we can do the hardcore stalking on Instagram and YouTube and whatever.
And the way it works out is over time, we've developed 2 different writing styles and therefore 2 different audiences. One would be the report file, the report format, which would typically be a PDF version of that would be kind of the one way to figure out for what audience it is. If it's a PDF, it's likely to be for law enforcement or for specialists or for think tanks that might spend the time to care about detail. Yeah. Then the other form would be just the blog form, which would typically be meant for journalists. As opposed to the general public. Over the last year or so, we've begun to sort of our foray into writing directly to the reader.
Are you always working at cross purposes with the law enforcement in the localities where you're doing research, or sometimes are you working in tandem?
No, it's with one possible exception, which is the MH17 investigation, where we have made it an exception to provide our findings to law enforcement, to the joint investigation team ahead of our publications. The rest of the time, it's always at cross. The work on the Skripal case was a particular example where British law enforcement were not happy with us jumping the gun and publishing findings that they were probably preferring to keep as leverage in their talks to Russia, maybe, or for whatever reason didn't want to publish, such as names of additional suspects. And as a result, we didn't get tips from them, which other media that are probably less likely to jump the gun are getting, like traditional mainstream media that've proven their worthiness to agencies. But yes, typically we would not have any form of cooperation with the example of joint investigation team, but there is a purely one-way cooperation. We provide data to them and we either get a smile or nothing back, but never information back from them. But we know it's worth it, so it's fine.
Bellingcat began as a purely open source investigative project, but it's gradually started using some of the same grade databases accessed by software marketed by GRCC that we talked about at the beginning of this podcast episode. I asked Arik and Christo about the ethical ramifications of turning to this kind of information, like this story about Chapiga, the Skripal poisoner attended GRU commander family wedding. That's the title. But it cites previously leaked Russian offline residential and car ownership databases, in addition to the social media stuff that you were just describing. Is this an ethical discussion within Bellingcat, that you're going to be using these sort of semi-legal, semi-what-have-you databases? And how does it how has it affected the kind of like mission statement of the project that you are now you have your fingers in even more pies?
It's a tough question about like exactly where do you draw the line with how far you go with researching information. So this is something we talk about quite a bit, but our general principle is do no harm and try not to share more than we have to. So, I mean, even if you look at, the New York Times versus the New York Post versus the New York Daily News, right? They'll have different standards about what they use, what kind of access they get and all that stuff, which is a bigger journalism question. But our general guideline with this is we'll get pretty much any leaked or offline database or collection of data we can find, because if we can access it, then it's it's kind of like half open, half closed source. Sometimes you have to pay a little bit of money to get these, pay 30, 40 euros or something for some of these databases. But most of them you can find online on a torrent file somewhere or another online. So the ones you mentioned earlier with the car registration, all that is, most of it is you could just plug in a link on your torrent and just scrape it right away. And also some of them have been indexed and online. So if you Google, there's a few, I think like nomer.org, nomer.org, they've indexed a lot of these leaked databases as well, like residential databases for Moscow especially. So a lot of these leaked databases are like, you have to have, proprietary software to access them, like the Russian version of Microsoft Access, more or less, to get into them. But a lot of them have been indexed online as well, and they're indexed on Google and Yandex and elsewhere. So with these things, we more or less try to, we use pretty much any offline database we can possibly get. In
procuring this black market information, Arik is eager to avoid one particular comparison.
But we don't procure hacked data. We're not WikiLeaks, I don't know, targeting people or trying to receive, or we don't receive personalized databases of hacked data either. Some GRU whatever hacks and gives it to us on, just not quite like that. But if it's available online, either for download or for a purchase at a low fee, then we'll go after that.
You can understand why Arik doesn't like comparisons to WikiLeaks, which is widely suspected of laundering intelligence leaked by Russian spies in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Bellingcat's critics like to characterize it as the Western authorities' response to WikiLeaks, a media outlet that works for NATO or other anti-Russian powers that be, Martians, aliens, you name it. But the point is that they supposedly launch hypocritical investigations into Russia. If you ever write about Bellingcat or even share their work on social media, you'll often run into folks who are convinced that Bellingcat is effectively an arm of Western intelligence, or that it's celebrated in the West for doing the same thing as WikiLeaks, albeit aimed mostly at Russia. Bellingcat's researchers acknowledge that they've had to adapt and turn increasingly to information that isn't always open source, but they insist that the essence of their work is the same as it always was.
What hasn't changed is the attention to forensic data. So I would say that all of our work is forensic data journalism. Some of it is open source and some of it is now closed source, which we try to keep to the minimum. Originally, we did only open source, but then government started reacting and hiding the data, purging data from social media networks. In particular, this was visible with the new law that was enforced in Russia that banned soldiers and officers from posting anything on their, especially photographs on their social media. They went back and deleted and purged a lot of the photographs that had been posted from Ukraine that we used for the initial findings on MH17 and the involvement of the 53rd Brigade. So we were confronted towards the middle of 2017 with a new reality where a government, in particular Russia in this case, was actively trying to purge the open source data that we previously had found and exposed. So then we had to decide, well, in what circumstances is it justified for us to go and reopen the Pandora's box of data at the expense of not using open source only. And we decided that would only be acceptable ethically when we're investigating state-level crime, state-level security services crime, because it's a Goliath. It's sort of a Goliath actor. You can't really disclose their mischiefs abroad by using open source data only, especially when they're actively trying to purge it.
Christo says his team also feels compelled to turn to great databases in its investigations because Bellingcat has proven itself to be one of the only organized groups with the skills needed to do this work, which is often the only way to catch state actors.
We found out that Western law enforcement is also not equipped with the knowledge or with the skill set or with the enthusiasm to go and look at these gray data sources. And therefore, if we didn't jump into that, then that information we felt was not going to be found. And therefore, an actor, a Goliath actor, would just have exclusivity on, first of all, on having illegal access and illegitimate access and even profiting from it, as your story suggests correctly, on its own people. But then nobody being able to defend those same people from that government. So we thought, well, whenever we talk about a substantiated suspicion or somebody's indictment or accusation against somebody that works or allegedly works for the Russian government and their secret services, it would be fine for us to go into this gray area. And yes, we're using the same data sources that they use. All of these leaked offline databases over the last 20 years are all downloadable. And if you know how to look for them, you can create your own archive of data, which we have. So we try to minimize the need to go and talk to sources that have this data for reasons of hygiene, but also for reasons of not exposing these sources to further risk. There was a lot of witch hunting by FSB after our initial disclosures on the Skripal suspects. They went after a lot of these data providers and sources. And even though none of those that got arrested were the people that we had worked with before, we felt guilty. So we tried to use the offline data as much as possible.
Eric says leaked information is especially useful when researchers need what he calls fossilized data. Here he is explaining what that means.
A lot of the data here is like fossilized or crystallized for when it was leaked. Because we also will sometimes look at some existing Russian government databases. A lot of these are freely available, and otherwise you have to, you may have to fib a little bit on online forums to get the data. But you can get it. It's not too difficult. And a lot of times that data will be changed because it's like a live, active, living database that the government can, add to, remove, change, or whatever. But this database that was leaked in 2016, if somebody doesn't do anything that's big and public and whatever until 2019, then, it's not like the government of Russia can go in there and time travel and change what the database looked like in 2016 and then release it online. Because these things are floating around. They have thousands of seeds on torrents and things like that. And, one person can't modify it and then change it for everyone else who's on the torrent. It's crystallized and fossilized as it was then. So that's actually a big plus for us is when we have these old offline databases, they're stuck as they are when they're released, and they aren't living documents, living databases like you have with, ongoing vehicle registration databases that if you were to do it, if you're a Russian policeman or insurance agent or something like that, and you search for it, that could be, those lifetime results could be modified. And they often are by whoever wants information changed.
But Eric emphasizes that Bellingcat's approach to investigative journalism is fundamentally unchanged, thanks largely to the continued blunders and laziness of Russia's intelligence agencies.
We're using roughly the same. I mean, we're still doing a lot of, social media stalking and looking for visual materials and referencing them and verifying them and all that stuff. But we've also been doing some topics that aren't quite as maybe fertile for those type of investigations. So with this, all the GRU stuff we do, a lot of times you can't find the GRU agents on social media. So we have to use some of these leaked databases as a crutch to get to more information. So, for example, we can use these databases. We can find their false identities, their second passwords they use, because we do this because they aren't very good at covering up their tracks. So, for example, the Mishkin, who's the second Skripal poisoner. So there's Anatoly Chapiga, who's the guy at the wedding. And there's Alexander Mishkin, who is a doctor who was the second man who helped with the Skripal poisoning. And this guy, we couldn't do this with just social media, but with some of these leaked databases, we have more capabilities now. He used the same first name, the same patronymic, and the same birth date for his fake identity, which was Alexander Petrov, as his real identity. So if you just search these databases with, first name, patronymic, and then wildcard for last name, and then the same birth date, there's only a handful of people with that information. And if you search them, eventually you find this guy's passport number is, 5 different than another GRU agent that we know. So they're issued in the same batch. So they're really, really, really bad at covering up their tracks. And I wish I could talk about it now, but we have another investigation coming out soon about another GRU agent that we found. And his cover identity is literally, his last name is literally 1 letter different than his real identity. He just changed his name by 1 letter. So again, this is something you can't look for on VK or Facebook or whatever. But if you have access to some of these databases, which, if you have a pirated copy of Chronos and a torrent file, then you can scrape it. Then you can just do some of these logical searches of, I have a guy, I have a GRU agent. I'm wondering what his fake passport, his fake identity is. Well, he probably uses the same birthday, same name, same patronymic, and you plug those in and you get a list of candidates that you can then research one by one. So we're still doing a lot of the stuff we've done before, but now we just have new avenues to kind of generate new leads and new ideas.
Okay, so there's a data leak problem inside the Russian state, particularly among law enforcement. The roots of the issue are money and corruption, and this flood of information also makes it possible for researchers inside Russia and abroad to track down and expose some of the Russian government's most secretive actions. The Kremlin knows this, so does that mean the leaks will be plugged? Both Meduzas Lilia Yapparova and Bellingcat's Hристо Grozев doubt it.
I don't see a way this problem can be solved. I don't think this is going anywhere. It's just the way these things are working in Russia now. And I don't see what magical force of nature could sweep it all away and change the way the things are right now.
No, I have hard evidence, reasons to believe that this is a machine. It's a money machine that will never be closed for as long as the FSB continues to exist. The FSB, I don't buy the argument that a lot of these data sets are leaked by law enforcement officers who want to cut the red tape. There's a little bit of that, but primarily it's money driven. It's a bunch of 20, 25 companies that are owned by former or current FSB officers or a combination of both, that pay good money for their colleagues or former colleagues to provide them with data sets that they aggregate, and then they provide it in a number of different platforms to private clients, to internal company security officers, to insurance agencies, and part of them are sold back to law enforcement, as correctly described in the Medusa story. But it's a money machine that is in the hundreds of millions by now. And I cannot imagine anything changing that, because the FSB is a utterly corrupt agency that, when instructed to cut down and clamp down on data crime, they will do it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months at best. But then they know they have to come back to turning a blind eye to it, because that's how they're getting a lot of their own money.
You've been listening to The Naked Pravda, a new podcast that highlights how Medusa's top reporting intersects with the wider research and expertise that exists about Russia. Today we looked at leaked databases and how the black market for this information has become a key aspect of Russian law enforcement and investigative journalism in Russia. On upcoming episodes of this show, we'll be looking at Russian tabloid journalism and its reverberations in the Western news media, and Kremlin clan politics and the power of the presidential administration. The Naked Pravda is a new podcast from Medusa, our first English-language show, and I hope you'll recommend us to your friends and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're tuning in to help put this program in front of more ears. Thanks for listening, and come back soon.